Excellent. So as we talked about at orientation, we weren't able to go over all of our online reporting as part of our initial session. So want to take some time today to walk you through OnCorps, our online reporting system. And for folks, if you're good, you don't have to chat in through the question bar now if you can see me okay, or hear me okay. So for OnCorps, we're going to go over OnCorps today, the different reporting that you're going to use in there, how to log timesheets, and what the different online reports are that you're going to use. And then we're also going to spend some time talking about expense reimbursements. As I mentioned, we saved a full hour for this webinar. Hopefully, it'll only take us about a half hour to go through everything, but we've got the time. Definitely don't hesitate to ask if you have any questions at all. So when you're going to OnCorps, I would recommend bookmarking the URL at the top of the page, so ca.oncorreports.com. This is going to be a website that you go to daily throughout the course of the service year, so make sure you have this starred when you start using it regularly. But when you log into ca.oncorreports.com, this page right here is what you're going to see on the screen. And hopefully you can see my cursor. So in the top right corner, there's a drop down that'll let you pick the year. So obviously 2017-18 is the default year now. And when you hit submit, it'll take you to all the different California AmeriCorps programs that are using OnCorps throughout the course of the service year. Okay, it sounds like for some folks, my audio is cutting out. If you're calling in through your computer audio, I would suggest switching that over to the phone audio. That often has a better connection than through Wi-Fi. But if anyone else is still having trouble, just let me know. So as you'll see, CivicSpark is at the top of the page, and we have separate portals for the water and climate tracks of the program. So I know that some of you are climate fellows, but you're working on water-related projects. If that's the case, please do log in through the climate portal. We have to keep you all of your hours in one place. So when you go in, you'll log in either through the water or climate portal down where it says AmeriCorps member. So once you log in, you'll end up in OnCorps reports on the home page. And all that you'll see there, it's pretty simple. It'll tell you when your next timesheet's due. There's a hyperlink there for you to go right to that timesheet, which is great. But I'm just going to walk you through some of the different features of OnCorps before going into timesheets. So obviously you've got, this is your home page. Under reporting, there are a number of different reports that we talked about at orientation. So your great stories, your volunteer log, as well as your gap assessments and your progress reports and your professional assessments are all in that custom reports tab at the bottom. Then under time tracking, this is where you're going to probably spend the most of your time entering timesheets. And then that's really about it. There are some FAQs if you need them for anything, but the reporting and time tracking tab are really where you're going to be using the most of your time. And I got a question about what the login information is. I think Ariadna mailed this out to you all in your CivicSpark email addresses, but it should be the first letter of your first name followed by your last name, and the temporary password should be CivicSpark. And the first time that you log in, it'll ask you to change that password. So if that's not working, email Ariadna and she can get you into your OnCorps report page. So gonna walk through a couple of these tabs now, starting with timesheets. So enter timesheets is where you're gonna go first. And when you click on the page, you see here, this will say, instead of test member, it'll have your name, it'll have the number of hours that you have remaining in the service year, as well as your expected end date. So for all of you now, that's August 10th, 2018. And for most of you, you're gonna be about 1,700 hours left. So you'll see here, you've got a drop down for every time card for the entire year. So for orientation, you'll pick that first time card period there, and it'll load. And as I'm sure you'll get to see pretty soon, OnCorps is a little bit slow. It doesn't load super quickly. That's just an unfortunate reality of this web page, but that's that with OnCorps. So this is what your timesheet looks like when you get into OnCorps. Obviously, there's a lot on there. So talk about what all these different things mean. Pretty self-explanatory. You'll list your time in and your time out for every portion of the day. So just a reminder, you have to log out for lunch. So for example, you'll put in you work from 9 to 12:30 or to 12, and then you do not have a separate line item for lunch. So 12:30 to 5:30. And along the side here, OnCorps will calculate the number of hours per day. So for this hour here, you have an 8-hour day, and when you go to auto-populate, it'll add that total up in the corner there. So, oops, 1 second, my control panel went away. There we go. So for each one of these line items, you have to select a category for your hours and a project that you're going to log that time to. So the categories are the major categories that you log all of your hours to. So you'll see under service, the subcategories are prep, volunteer service, and service. And under training, you have volunteer training and regular training. So the categories that have the 3 asterisks next to them, you shouldn't be using those. Always use one of the subcategories below them. So say, for example, you're logging your hours for orientation, you'll select training. And then for your projects, so this is the climate portal. So we've got all of the climate projects and beneficiaries that we have so far. So it's a pretty long list. But you'll see up at the top, the AA categories are our sort of generic training, outside training, things like that. But for orientation, you're going to log your hours to AA CivicSpark training. And then for description or activity, you will list that here. So there's a word or a character limit for each one of these boxes. It's not a lot, but you need to include as much detail as possible. So got a question, how specific do you want our description or activity? So if you're working on your service project, for example, you shouldn't just say like, working on service project. You should say, what were you doing? If you were working on writing your report, I would say that. If you spent the morning reviewing and responding to work-related emails, I would put that as the description. Typically, if you put something like emails or writing, we'll bump it back to you and ask for there to be a little bit more of a description as to what you were doing. And another question that we got around training is transportation for orientation characterized as training. So anything that is related to orientation, related to any CivicSpark training would go into that same category. So that would be training, AA CivicSpark training. Any transportation time associated with a particular task is logged as that same task. So for example, if you're logging, say your hours are for service and you work for City of Fremont on their community development project, any driving time would also be logged to that project if you had to go off site for it. So driving time is just logged the same as anything else. That's a good question. And when you're logging in your different increments, we got a question about how granular can you be. Please do not be more specific than 15-minute intervals. You can get as granular as that, but try not to do like 5 or 7 minutes. That's really hard for us to track. So you can be as specific as 15-minute intervals. Another question about how to log carpooling time for orientation or for regional training, things like that. Same, it doesn't matter if you weren't driving, you had to be present for that time. So you would log that as CivicSpark training as well. And we got a question yesterday for folks of you who have already gone into the portal. If you went in yesterday, the project categories for some reason were reset by OnCorps, so they're updated now. For anybody who has already logged hours in OnCorps, we are going to be unlocking your timesheets later this week, and you'll have to relog those. I'm sorry about that. We didn't realize that there was a glitch in the system. So if you already logged hours, those categories are no longer there. You have all of these drop downs right now. So anyway, so going back to the portal here, this is pretty much it with the different features. Would just say, again, you'll see for all the projects, we have every single beneficiary listed, not just the projects. So if you're working with LA County Department of Public Health, for example, I've got them up here. There are 4 different beneficiaries. So when it's very clear which project you're working on, you should, when it's clear, just pick whatever beneficiary you're working for. But for projects or work that really hit on all the beneficiaries, split your time evenly, really make sure you're working on all the beneficiaries throughout the year. And communicate with us if you feel like there's a change in your beneficiary structure. Definitely happens every year where a beneficiary that we didn't have at the beginning of the year is added, or likewise we have a beneficiary that filled out a capacity assessment but then they end up dropping from the program. Communicate with us so that we can update the time card categories accordingly. So we've got a bunch more questions that are coming through. So can you add more lines to the day? I don't believe that you can. I think you have to keep it within the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines. So if you, I'm looking at Emily to see if she can think of any time that fellows have had more than that, but I don't think so. I would just try to keep it. You shouldn't need to have more than 7 lines in a day. And, if for some reason you were jumping back and forth a lot, you can condense similar tasks into the same line item. And just if you have 4 beneficiaries, you can have no more than 4 lines, if that makes sense. So condense if you feel like you need more than 7 lines, but hopefully that shouldn't be an issue. So some other questions. And if you have any specific questions about the beneficiaries that you have in there, talk to your RC or talk to Emily about them. These are codes. We can only have so many characters for each one of these beneficiary line items on the timesheet. So sometimes we had to shorten them and it's not entirely sure what they mean, but they all correspond to one of the capacity assessments that have been submitted for you. So if you can't figure out how the different project categories align with your capacity assessments, reach out to your regional coordinator or to Emily and they can clarify that for you. And for folks who, another question about if I'm just getting on site and it's only my 2nd day and I haven't done a lot, would I just log my hours to 1 beneficiary? So in the first 2 weeks at least, remember you can be logging a lot of those hours to prep. So under service, you would use the prep category. And then for your beneficiaries, you should still balance it out. If you are clearly working on one beneficiary or the other, log your prep hours to that. But even if you're only working a few hours, just alternate days or something to share the wealth between your beneficiaries. And then another question about how to log transportation time. We do not log regular commuting time for general service work, correct? Yes, that is correct. You do not log your morning commute. That is not work time. That's something that's done on your own time. Any travel that is for a training or for your service project can be counted. But again, that's not, you cannot log commuting as service work. And then for a question about the different time intervals, can you have an activity end at one time and then another activity start at that same time? Yes, you can. There doesn't need to be a minute gap in between intervals. You can just have them line up directly. And the only gap that you have to have in your schedule is lunch every day. But other than that, everything can just go one into the other. So I got a question from somebody, and I'm just going to have them clarify what they mean by that. For somebody who asked about starting elsewhere other than your site address, if you could just provide a little bit more clarification, that would be great. So another question about orientation. Do we log dinner bonding time we spent with fellows Tuesday evening of orientation? Yes, you can log the time that you spent with dinners Tuesday evening, so long as there was not happy hour or alcohol involved. Just another reminder, you cannot log any time for anything involving alcohol. So I will let you interpret that. So would we log the time that we walk to and from the pagoda building during orientation? Yes, you can log that time. Don't log the time for breakfast, but you can log the time after that. That's not a typical commute. That's just that's an event. It's a good question. And for this webinar specifically, you would log this to training, CivicSpark training. So another good question for that. Okay, so I got a little more clarification on offsite meetings and how to log that time. So for example, if the question was, if you have a meeting that's not at your site, your service site, that starts at 8:30, for example, how would you log that? So, and we'll go over this when we transition to the expense reimbursement side of things. Your starting point for all travel is your office location. So similarly for expense reimbursements, you can never calculate a travel originating from your home. You can only originate from your office. So if you are traveling somewhere off-site and it is farther away from your home than your office was, you can, if it's 15 minutes farther away than it would take for you to get to your office, you can log 15 minutes of time because that would be in addition to your standard commute. And I'll make more clarifications about the travel reimbursement side of things when we switch over to that, but hopefully that clears up that question. And another question about orientation, can we log hours for open mic night? Yes, you definitely can. That was bonding time with the fellows, so go ahead and log that time. And then another clarification that somebody asked about for dinner time at orientation, do we log that as a different line item or continuation of training from before? And you can log it as the same line item so long as you can, say that it did both. So I think, if you would say something like orientation training activities and evening bonding activities. But that being said, you should be logging out at least a half hour for mealtime. So you will probably have to create a new line item for that. So you can go up until 5 o'clock, and then from 5:30 onward, you can log that time. I know everyone was sitting at dinner for more than an hour every day. So you can still capture some of that time, but you do need to log out for just a half hour at mealtime. And then another question about when you can start logging time is that we just got is about when is your actual start of your service date and when can you start capturing those hours? The first service date is either the first date of orientation if you passed your background check before orientation, or whatever the first date that you passed your background check is. So if you passed your background check on the third day of orientation, say on Wednesday, doesn't matter what time of day you passed your background check, you can log hours for that entire day. So if you're unsure the status of your background check, follow up with Ariadna. I think she's been in contact with everybody who still hasn't passed, but you cannot backlog hours before you pass your background check either. So if you didn't pass your background check till the third day of orientation, unfortunately, you cannot capture the hours for those first 2 days. California Volunteers does not let us backlog. So if you have any specific questions about your background check, just reach out to Ariadna. And then another question about using this timesheet. Can we log our hours every day, or do we have to wait until the end of the week? As we said at orientation, strongly recommend that you do log your hours every single day. So when you scroll down to the bottom of the timesheet, you'll see there's a save and a submit button. So if you don't want to actually submit it for approval, just hit save. And you'll see at the bottom here, it does say, I certify that these hours do not include any lunches or breaks I've taken in this period. So just a constant reminder to take a lunch break. And when you hit save, you'll see that now in that drop-down list, it'll say that it was saved. So then you can click back on that again, and it'll pull back up whenever you log back into OnCorps with those hours preloaded. So just another clarification, yes, a background check is your live scan. It's also any out-of-state checks that you might have needed to conduct, whether or not that be a live scan. So it's both your live scan fingerprinting and any other background checks that you had to do out of state. And then, again, I think getting a couple of questions for folks who need to make edits to their timesheets. Everybody who has already submitted a timesheet that will be declined today, so that you can go back in and make edits. And if you ever realize that you made a mistake, let your regional coordinator or Emily know, and we can unlock that timesheet for you so that you could resubmit it. Chances are your regional coordinator or Emily are going to realize any mistakes that have been made, and they will decline that timesheet for you. So if, for example, you submit this whole timesheet and then your regional coordinator opens it and said, whoa, you didn't actually log hours on Sunday, they'll decline it and send it back to you with a message, and that'll pop up when you come into OnCorps, and you can just click right on that. You'll see the comments that your RC made, and you'll be pretty easily able to go in and make any changes.
And can I just add, for Water Fellows, since your site supervisor will be approving your time cards, if Ariadna or myself go through and unlock your time cards, your site supervisor will receive an email, as will you, letting you know that the time cards have been unlocked, and then your site supervisor, will have to go in and reapprove your time cards. So if you are having any time cards unlocked, make sure you let your site supervisor know that they have to go back in to approve your time cards.
Great, thanks, Emily. So, wow, lots of good questions. Okay, are we required to take breaks in addition to lunch? And if we do take breaks, we have to remove those hours from the record. So you are not required by AmeriCorps to take any additional breaks on top of lunch, but that checkbox at the bottom just pretty much means if you decide to take a break in the afternoon and are out of the office, you need to log out for that time. So that's the only requirement. Are we fine to submit timesheets for last week's CivicSpark training once this webinar is over? Yes, you are. All the time card categories should be up to date now, so you should be fine to go in. So another question, my site supervisor wants us to get immunizations. How do we log this time? Wow, that is the first I've ever heard of that. So similarly, for folks whose site supervisors require them to go like off-site for a training or off-site to get background checked, you can log that time as service, because that is something that your site supervisor is asking you to do. So anything that your site supervisors require of you, you should log that to the project itself. Should we log our lunch hours before a certain time, and are there any lunch penalties that we should avoid? No, you don't have to. I think LGC's policy is that it should be about between noon and 2, but we don't enforce that. I think in general, just try to take lunch at a reasonable time. I know that all of you are going to have different schedules. Some of you are going to be working. I know we've had fellows work like starting at 7 a.m. So if you need to take an earlier lunch break, that's fine. Just try to have it in the middle of the day. So a question about passing live scans. So can we start logging hours from the date that live scans were sent to LGC? No, we need to have received the results of your background check before you begin logging time. So you need to know the date from Ariadna at which you passed your background check, not the date that it was submitted. For a lot of you, it's the same date. We received a lot of background check results the day they were submitted, but not for all of you. So just clarify that with Ariadna if you're not sure.
Can I just add something? In terms of background checks, if you are from out of state, you will start logging hours the date that your last background check, likely your out-of-state background check, was passed. So if, for example, you passed your live scan on the 5th of August, but you didn't pass your out-of-state background check until the week of orientation, you would only be able to start logging hours the date that you passed your out-of-state background check.
So got a question from somebody saying that my supervisor said I won't be working with one of my beneficiaries at all. If that's the case, talk to your RC ASAP, because we need to find a new beneficiary for you, or clarify that. You need to hit 200 hours in order to serve that beneficiary officially. So chat with your RC or chat with Emily and we can figure that out. So if we didn't carpool to orientation, and can we still log that as training? I would say depending on where you came from, for folks who came from out of state, you can't log hours for all of that travel time, but traveling from your service site to orientation, even if you didn't carpool, you can get reimbursed for that, but yes, you can log hours for that. Let's see, lots of questions. So can you clarify time logs for the carpool to orientation? Are we logging those hours on the road or just the mileage? Both. So if you, again, we're just talking about logging time now. We'll talk about expense reimbursements later, but work required or training required travel, you can log time for. In almost all cases, you can also get reimbursed for that, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. What about non-Tuesday, non-alcoholic bonding time during orientation? Yes, you can log time for other activities that you did with fellows at the hostel, or obviously at the pagoda building, so long as it was, as you said, non-alcoholic. Great question. Can you clarify out-of-state background checks? Can you begin logging once you pass the background checks or once CivicSpark receives the results? So in almost all cases, those are the same day, but it's from the date that you pass your check. So we've had cases where a fellow passes their background check, but we don't get notified for 2 or 3 days. You can log your hours effective the date that all of your background checks were passed. So we will clarify that for you if you're still in limbo, but if you're not sure which date to use, again, chat with Ariadna, but that's a great question. And got a question from somebody, I've not yet received confirmation of my background check, but I'm still logging hours for my beneficiary. You cannot be logging hours at all if you have not yet passed your background check. So you just have to, unfortunately, hold tight, and we can, if it becomes an issue, we can extend your service at the end of the year to allow for more time if you need more time, but hold off on logging hours until you've passed all your background checks. And do you consider 10-minute breaks as breaks, say 2 10s and a lunch? AmeriCorps does not require 10-minute breaks or have any sort of policy around those. So I would talk with your site supervisor on how they would like those to be logged. I think a lot of offices will have 10-minute breaks just built into the workday, and in that case, you don't have to log out for them. But have a conversation with your site supervisor about what the on-site expectations are for breaks. Okay, so lots of really great questions about timesheets. One additional question that we got is, how do I save the project drop-down list? And that's a great question. So I'm trying to remember exactly how it is done, and I believe, so if you go to the top, here we go. Okay, so if you go up top, there's the welcome test member. It'll say welcome name. And then there's a link that says view edit profile. So when you click on that, this is what will pop up. It'll have all of your personal, your login information. This is where if you want to reset your password, you can do that in here. And then on the right side, it'll say you can select a default. So if you say you want it to be Fremont Community Development, you'll hit save. And then whenever you go in to edit a timesheet, that should be a preloaded option. There we go, boom. So again, you can't log more than one. So if you're balancing between your different beneficiaries, you'll just have to change that to the other beneficiary for some of your timesheets. And then obviously you'll just have to select the training drop down or outside training or volunteer engagement, things like that if need be. But that is definitely an easy way to speed up the timesheet process. So with that, unless there are any more questions about logging time, I'm just going to walk you through some of the other features of OnCorps. So something else that we're going to be working with you closely on throughout the year is what your total number of hours are. But an easy way for you to check that, you can actually pull your total hours by date. So under time tracking, member total hours by date, and you can actually create a report that look for a time period from the start of the service year to now, how many hours do you have to work, things like that. And that is right here. So if you pull this up, you pulled up my report, and I say, okay, I haven't actually logged any hours yet because I have not submitted my timesheet. But it says that there are 46 weeks left. I need to work 1,700 hours. And it gives you an example of, how many hours per week you should be working, the hour average per week that you're currently working, which is 0, as well as some other stats about your service year. So this is some way that you can be proactive about looking at your total hours. So definitely keep that in mind. And you'll see that the average per week that you need to hit is under 40. Again, this doesn't automatically calculate holidays and the 40 hours of personal time. So that's why it doesn't say 40 hours there, but helpful tool for you to keep on top of your hours throughout the service year. So that's the time tracking feature of OnCorps. Another tool is the reporting tab. So under reporting, there are a couple of different reports. So submit reports, these are our pre-loaded AmeriCorps reports. So I'll show you your great stories first. You'll click on add a new great story. And this is it. It's a really, really simple form. You put in the title of your great story, the date which you submitted it, and then describe your story below. There's an 8,000 character limit, so you have a pretty good amount of time. But anyway, so you can also save and attach a file if that's easy for you. You can attach PDFs, you can attach photos, things like that. So pretty simple. For the reporting period, this doesn't honestly mean too much. just try to estimate which quarter the month is in that you're submitting for, but use your judgment. We're not going to really keep track of that, but it is a required field by OnCorps. So that is the Great Story feature. Some other reporting documents that you'll need to use, so the volunteer mobilization log. I'm just going to show this to you now. You don't really need to use it that much at this part of the service year, but this is what it looks like. When you are filling out your volunteer log, again, you've got duration, ongoing or one time. The reporting period is over here in the corner. And then you do need to say the event name, the date, and then just this number of volunteers and number of volunteer hours served. All the other fields you don't really need to worry about, but we do require that you create some sort of narrative. Be as descriptive as possible. It's really, really helpful to have a clear outline of what you were logging hours for. And then for the total number of hours served, you have to list the total that all of your volunteers served. So OnCorps used to be smart, and if you put in 2 volunteers and the number of volunteer hours served, you put 2 hours, it used to be able to multiply and give you a total. It doesn't do that anymore. So you need to list the total number of volunteers and then the total number that they all together served. And then you put that in that box there. So got a question coming through about logging volunteer time. We have an ongoing volunteer event, like I meet with mine every Wednesday from 5 to 8. Do I need to create a volunteer mobilization log for every Wednesday? It's a great question. Do not create a separate log for every week. You have to save for all of your ongoing volunteers. You have to save them all till the end. Otherwise, even though it is you, every single time, OnCorps will think that every single instance, it's a different set of volunteers. So you would essentially be double counting or triple counting or quadruple counting all those volunteers. So for all of your ongoing volunteers, save them till the end and submit one report for all of them so that we're not double counting those numbers. That's a great question. So then the last place we're going to be looking are custom reports. And this is where your progress reports, your gap assessments, and your fall professional assessments will be held. So you click on Submit Custom Reports. Takes a second to load. Okay, so you'll see here, these are all of the different reports that are assigned to you. So when you want to submit one of these, you will just go into select the report, so say the fall performance assessment. So another question about volunteers. So in order to accurately represent the number of unique volunteers, I should not log their hours in OnCorps until the end of the year. Yes, that's correct. For all volunteers, you might think that volunteer A is only coming to one event, but then they might come up again, and then again and again, and then that one-time volunteer turns into a ongoing volunteer. So hold on to all your volunteer numbers, regardless if they're one-time or ongoing, until the end of your project, so that you can accurately represent them. That's a great question. And then a question about the gap assessments. Are we actually submitting 6 different gap assessments? No, we just give you a bunch of forms to have some flexibility. Some fellows submit several gap assessments. You do not have to submit 6. We just opened up a bunch of different forms for you so that you have some flexibility. And if you need to submit several, you have different ways to do that, but no, you do not need to submit 6 individual gap assessments. So for the fall performance assessment, you'll go in, you'll select your name and submit. And then this is what the form looks like. And all of the custom reports come up this way. They're not very pretty, but they're pretty self-explanatory. You'll fill everything out, and then at the bottom, there's a save and a submit button. And same thing goes for gap assessments and progress reports. You can go in and save things, but when you actually want to submit it, make sure you hit the submit button. There's no way for us to see reports that you've just saved. So if you've just saved a report, there's no way, that's not actually submitted. So note that difference. It comes up every year where people think they've submitted something, but they haven't. So that is the fall performance assessment. Just want to show you a few other custom reports. Sorry, it's a little bit slow. So the progress report here, one of these will become active every single month so that you can go in and submit a new one. But this is what they look like. So we got a question about the fall performance assessments. Somebody asked, do I need to submit the fall performance assessment? It says not requiring approval on mine. Yes, the not requiring approval is just an OnCorps back-end thing. That doesn't mean anything about whether or not you need to submit it. That just means whether or not we can see it and it can be submitted without an approval in between. So yes, everyone needs to submit a fall performance assessment, regardless of whether or not it needs to be approved. So this is the fall or the monthly progress report. You're going to submit this every single month. It's very, very simple and straightforward. You put in your project title and then provide a general update on your capacity building efforts to date, and then just a short description of any issues or challenges that we should know about, or any additional resources that you need. And Emily and your regional coordinator will be reading these every month. They actually are read, but if there are things that are put in here that do need to be elevated, RCs and Emily are going to have different ways for tracking these things throughout the year. Make sure you're communicating about your project, your progress report monthly. A lot of you are going to have tracking sheets or things like that where you're going to be putting this information, but just communicate about these things. I think that's about it for the progress report. It's another pretty straightforward report. Okay, a bunch more questions coming through. Does the progress report include this month? So yes, you're working almost the full month of September, so you should submit one for the month of September by the end of this month. You have until the first couple of days of the following month to submit them. Your RCs are going to communicate with you about the due dates for those, but you do need to submit a progress report for September. And how much time should we take writing up these reports? I would say try to keep all of these to about 2 hours per month. I know that we've had fellows spend like 8 hours writing a really intricate, great story. And while I really appreciate reading them, we really want to try to limit the amount of time that you're spending on these. So try to keep all of your monthly reporting to about 2 hours. When is the performance assessment due? All of your RCs and Emily should be coordinating with you directly about those due dates. There's some slight variations in those, so just keep an eye out. And if you're not sure, chat with staff and we can give you your specific due date. And another question, what if my site is not planning for me to work with volunteers? That's fine, but everyone still does have either 150 hours for climate or 100 hours for water, where you do need to be working on volunteer engagement. So it's fine if it doesn't happen through your service site. You'll just be working with your regional team to create a separate volunteer engagement project, and you can chat with your RC about that. Okay, so I think that is everything with OnCorps. Another quick thing that has definitely confused folks in the past, when you go to custom reports, submit custom reports and view custom reports are surprisingly close to each other and very similar. And we've had folks go in here, and this is a search function. It looks like it's a report. It's very similar. But if you type everything in here and hit submit, it's just going to conduct a search. It's not actually going to submit it to us. So make sure that you're actually in the submit dropdown, not the view dropdown when you're submitting your monthly reports. Also, always a good practice, as we said during orientation, to keep your reports in a Word document ahead of time, so that just in case there's a glitch, you have a backup copy of it. But that's just one other distinction to make. Okay, so any other questions about OnCorps that folks have? I think that pretty much wraps up this walkthrough. And I'm just going to start pulling up the expense reimbursements now, but in the meantime, I'll just give another minute or so for folks to type in any other questions that they have. Okay. So a couple of other questions. Should we log writing the reports as service? Yes. Any admin related to CivicSpark, you log to your specific project and a beneficiary, not to any other category. So any admin related work, you will log to the beneficiary. That's a great question. And can we log everything in these first 2 weeks as prep? Pretty much everything is going to be logged as prep for the first 2 weeks on site. Even though it's prep, you do log that to a beneficiary. But again, if you do have anything that is actual training time, such as meeting with your, some CivicSpark staff member, or some of you are going to have some cohort calls or regional meetings this week, those things should be logged as training, but anything else that you're doing on site for the first 2 weeks can likely just be logged as prep. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the expense reimbursement forms and run through this quickly. These are pretty straightforward. We're going to be sending out slightly updated ones to all of you, but we're going to have an interim report in the meantime that you can just submit your orientation expenses on. But there are separate forms for climate and water. Like OnCorps, they are preloaded with all of the project dropdowns. So you'll see here, for example, this is last year's form. We've got training, non-project service, volunteer engagement, and then all of our projects. Expenses don't need to be logged to a beneficiary, so you'll just have your project partners listed here. So it's a little bit of a shorter list. Couple of other components of the expense reimbursement form. So your name goes here. Please use your full legal name. This is the name that our accounting team is going to pull to write our checks, and we've definitely had folks not being able to cash checks because they've used nicknames. So put your full legal name on the expense reimbursement form. Even though we know who you are, our accounting team might not know what name you go by. So in terms of the address, this is the address that you would like your check mailed to. So please make sure you get that right. You will not believe the number of bounce checks that we get every year, or every month, because people mistype their addresses here. So make sure you double, triple check that so that your check does not get sent to the wrong address. Period is typically the month that you're submitting your expenses for. For some months, you will only be submitting it for a couple of weeks. So just list whatever dates that your expenses cover. Office is the address of your office, because as I said, all work-related travel needs to originate from your office. So that's the address that our accounting team will use to double check your mileage rates. So let's see, I'm getting a couple of additional questions coming through. Are reimbursements not direct deposited? No, we are not able to do direct deposits for reimbursements. Those have to be sent as a physical check. So they're just, again, calculate that in when you're thinking how long it's going to take to get reimbursed. And Does the address have to be the same one as that on the void check that we wrote? No. We know that addresses have been updated since then, so you can change the address, but it's also pretty good practice to update us every time your address is changed. We keep track of your address in many more places other than just this reimbursement form, and we need to update your address on different pieces of paperwork as well. So not only change your address on these expense reimbursement forms, but email us when your address changes so that we can write that down. Okay, a bunch more questions. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this expense reimbursement form, and then I'm going to get to the questions. I think some of those are going to be answered as I go through. So that's up at the top there. Do not change the project number. That's an LGC internal project code. So you'll do not change that at all. The project here on the side is what you're going to be changing, but this is fixed. And then the submission date here, that's the actual date that you submit it. If you're a water fellow, to your site supervisor for approval, and if you're a climate fellow, the date you submit it to your regional coordinator for approval. So when you're filling out one of these lines, you have to put a lot of information into these expense reimbursements. The date that the expense was accrued, incurred, not the date that you're submitting it. So the actual date that you spent money or traveled, things like that. The purpose of the trip. Be descriptive there. If you say travel to meeting, accounting will usually ask questions about, well, was that a training meeting? Was that for work? So there's no word limit on these, but you don't write an essay, but be descriptive there. The from address, so for all service-related travel, that should be from your address of your office. Likewise, when you're traveling to a regional meeting or something like that, have the destination be, or the starting point be from your work office. This is not just an LGC rule that we're putting on you. That's just an official auditing and accounting procedure. So we do need to have it from an official office in order to reimburse you. I know that for some of you, when you traveled to orientation, you weren't starting at your office location. If you are we're traveling from a different region that is not your service site, chat with us. We want to obviously reimburse you for that if you are carpooling with folks. But just coordinate with your regional coordinator or myself, and I can definitely clarify. But in general, even if you're leaving from home for an event, you have to list your office location unless it is like significantly longer to travel from your office. That's the only time where our accounting team will let you start from home for a reimbursement, is if it is a shorter distance if you were traveling from home. So then the to address, obviously self-explanatory, you list that there. And then you have to go into Google Maps and list the number of miles that it took to travel to and from, or if you have, if you checked your odometer, you list that there. Typically, our accounting team uses the shortest distance on Google Maps, and they've got a little bit of flexibility there, but in general, it should be the shortest distance if possible that you're taking. The cost of miles will automatically update. This is the federal rate for reimbursement for mileage. So that is obviously, that's going to cost more than gas. So you do not get reimbursed separately for gas if you're using your own car to travel. The only time that you get reimbursed for gas is if you are using a rental car, which should happen maybe once, not very often throughout the course of the service here. All of these other things are pretty self-explanatory. Public transit, if you are using public transit for work, get a receipt. I know that you often don't grab a receipt when you're paying for a bus fare or something like that, but you do always need to grab a receipt for anything that you're getting reimbursed for. Meals obviously need to be itemized. It needs to have everything that was incorporated into that cost. Parking, again, get receipts for that. If you are using a coin-op meter, say that in the description of your trip. That's the only time that we can cover the cost of parking without a receipt. So keep track of that. And similarly for tolls, most of you will have a fast track pass, and in that case you can submit the invoice, your monthly invoice for that, to show that you paid the toll. But otherwise, if you're going through a toll, they can give you a receipt if you're paying in cash. Just ask for that. Other expenses really shouldn't, you're probably not going to have to use that at all, but if there is anything else that you're getting reimbursed for, talk to your RC or talk to Emily, talk to me. You need to get approved for any other expenses that aren't in one of these categories ahead of time. So then for the task, these are very similar. I mean, the project, I should say, these are very similar to the time card categories, pretty self-explanatory there. And then for task, if you go to the second tab here, we will be providing you a list of what each one of these tasks stands for, and then you can just keep that on hand, but they're mostly related to different travel expenses. So we'll send you that list with this form after the webinar today so that you can get everything going with your reimbursements. So a couple of other things, signature needs to be electronic. You cannot, under any circumstance, print this out and send it to us as a PDF. Your site supervisor, if you're a water fellow, might ask you to do that, but needs to be electronic. There are a couple of online applications where you can create an electronic signature. You can also just take a picture of your signature and drop it in as an image, but make sure that you are sending this along as a live Excel document. All right, so got a ton of questions here. Going to try to run through these quickly. Is this webinar being recorded? Yes, we will be sending out a copy of this so you can refer back to it if need be. And then are we going to be getting the PowerPoint slides from orientation? We're hoping to get that to you this week. A couple of our speakers didn't send us the PowerPoints, so we're working with them to get those, but should hopefully have everything to you by the end of this week. So the Excel sheet, this isn't uploaded to OnCorps. We can, if you go onto OnCorps, and when you're going to log in, there's a login page and then a resources tab as well. We will likely upload it there as well, but we'll be sending all of these resources out via email shortly after the webinar. And in terms of the final expense reimbursement form with the updated projects, that'll likely be sent to you very soon, probably next week, but we'll be sending you an interim form so that you can submit your expenses for orientation in the meantime. So is there a limit on travel reimbursements? For example, can I take a train to regional meetings, or do I have to take a Greyhound? Talk to your RC or talk to Emily about travel. In general, we do have a limited budget for reimbursement, so we want to do things as cost effectively as possible. You should be carpooling whenever possible, or taking public transportation. If you have to go longer distances, chat with your RC or chat with Emily, and we can come up with a plan for your specific reimbursement for those meetings. But for your service-related travel, there is a $400 limit on how much we can reimburse you for your project, and that's something that your project partner knows, and they have that number in mind as well. So make sure that whenever you're doing something for your project, you're chatting with your project partner to make sure that they're on board with the expenses that you're accruing for your sites, for your service-related expenses. There is a limit on those. We'll let you know and let your partner know when you're getting close to that. That shouldn't be an issue, but that's the only place where there's a really firm limit. Does a Clipper card fare history work as a receipt? Yes, it does. That's what folks who do use a Clipper card, that's what you'll need to submit every month. Similarly, if you're in other regions, any other fare pass, you just need to submit an invoice for that so that we see. And just when you are submitting that, highlight the lines of expenses that you're reimbursing for so that we can clearly pick those out. So can we get reimbursed for travel to and from getting a live scan? We can't reimburse you for that travel unless was a special circumstance, but that is something that's typically required as part of your sort of new hire activities. So we're not reimbursing for that. Hopefully that's not an issue for folks, but if you do have any questions about that, just reach out to us and we can chat. And in terms of who you send the form to, so just to reiterate, our climate fellows, once you've completed the form, entered your electronic signature, send it to your regional coordinator. Water fellows, it'll need to be sent first to your site supervisor for approval and then to Emily. For non-travel related reimbursements, do we just leave the address and mileage sections blank? Yes, you do. So if you are, yeah, I guess I don't really have to say more than that. You can leave those blank if it's not travel related. I'm trying to see just a lot of questions here that I'm flipping through. If you had to redo your live scan and we told you you would be reimbursed for that, just explain that you had to redo it, and that should be fine. We've let accounting know that those expenses are going to be coming through. So for all of these things, I'm going to be sending out a link with the form to a handy app that Emily shared to collect all of your receipts. Your receipts need to be included as part of these emails, and all of this, just again as a reminder, is in the back of your handbook. We have a whole guide to submitting your expense reimbursements, but I'll send an app along so you could just take a picture of your receipts, upload them, and it automatically makes PDFs, super handy. But for all of your reimbursements, collect and save your receipts and send them along with your form. So another question, do we separate each line item for round trip? Yes, so if you are doing something round trip, you should create 2 separate lines for that. You can pretty much copy and paste the addresses, but it does need to be separated out so that we can see the different legs. And doesn't matter if it's a scan or a picture of the receipts, as long as we have the receipts and it's legible, it doesn't matter the particular format. All right, sorry, just looking through a couple of questions, see if I missed anything. Does having mileage for carpooling start from the office, even if we didn't carpool from the office? It should start from your office. If it did not, chat with your RC about that, and we can discuss the different options for getting you reimbursed for that. But in general, reimbursement costs should start and end from the office. But chat with your RC if that's not the case. Okay, got another question again, clarifying the period. The period is when the expenses happened. So you can list typically a month, but sometimes it's just a few weeks. So you put the dates in there that the expenses fall under.
And I'll just add, if you're submitting expenses from 2 different months, our accounting department would prefer that you submit 2 separate forms for each month. So for example, if you happen to forget the previous month or some expense that you want to submit for 2 previous months, you'll want to submit those on 2 separate forms.
Great question. And it's not even prefer, they require it. So make sure that you're doing that. And even if it's, I mentioned this at orientation, even if you're just submitting an expense reimbursement for like $5, please submit it at the end of the month. Do not hold on to it for the next month. There is a 90-day limit on which we can reimburse you for different expenses. So if you hold on to things for really more than 2 months, you cannot be reimbursed for them. So even if it's small, please submit them at the end of the month. So a question about orientation dinners. At orientation, we put all the meals on my card for Tuesday dinners. I have their names down, but do I log that I paid for 4 other meals on top of mine? So please, in that case, just say that you submitted on the expense reimbursement form under description, say that you paid for several different folks. And then when you send the email along to your RC to get that approved, just in the body of the email include who all you paid for. We'll send that along to accounting, but you don't need to actually list that detail in the expense reimbursement form itself. That's a great question. And then if the live scan was paid in July, would that be the period of, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, so if you have your live scan and it was done in a different month, please have that on a separate expense reimbursement form so that our accounting team can separate those out. And for the period, just say whatever month you did your expense reimbursement, your live scan in. All right, let's see. Are we getting reimbursed for parking at orientation? Yes, just submit your receipts for that. All right. How often do the expense reimbursement forms need to be filled out? Every single month. If you don't have any expenses for a month, obviously you don't need to fill one out, but at minimum, submit them every month. If you have expenses, you can fill them out sooner if you have expenses of more than $50, and this is stated in the handbook. If you have expenses of more than $50, you can submit it sooner so that you can get reimbursed for it, but otherwise, make sure you're submitting them at the end of every month.
And I'll just add for water fellows and also the majority of climate fellows, we will be tracking your expense reimbursements on your project implementation tracking sheets that Kristen mentioned before. So your RC or myself will discuss this in greater detail, but we want to empower you to also be tracking your project related expenses so that you're aware of where you're at with your $400 budget.
Great. Getting another questions about the period. It really, there aren't specific rules for filling out the period. You don't have to include the year. If you do, that's fine. Anything really works so long as we can trace it back to a date. And how does it work for gratuity and tax on dinner? So when we give you a limit for the amount that we can reimburse you up to, that includes tax and gratuity. That's how much we have budgeted for that meal per person. So keep that in mind. If you happen to go over that, please let us know so that we can have a conversation about that. But moving forward, your project partner similarly might give you limits on how much you can spend on a meal. That includes tax and gratuity when you're doing that. All right, so that was the last question that I had. This might have set a record for most questions asked during a webinar, which is awesome. If you have any other specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be more than happy to continue to chat about this if you have any questions. Again, this is recorded. I'll be sending out a link to a YouTube video later today so that you can access this later if you have any questions. And similarly, we'll be sending out the Excel forms with the information on the different tasks and projects later today as well. So another question, if we did not keep parking receipts for orientation, will we still be able to be reimbursed? That's not guaranteed for parking. Typically, if we don't have a receipt and it wasn't in a meter, our accounting team will not reimburse you for that. So reach out to your RC and we can have a conversation about what we might be able to do. But always, 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 always save your receipts for anything that you might be able to be reimbursed for. So at this point, we've run pretty far over. So I think I'm going to end it here, and any other questions can be directed to either your RC or to Emily moving forward. And then I guess one other question, if you did not get a receipt and you can provide a bank statement, that sometimes is accepted, but chat with your RC about that and we can provide some clarification. But with that, I will go. Thank you so much for joining today and being so engaged. Hopefully this answered all the questions that you have, but don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything else that we can help you with. I hope you have a really great rest of your Tuesday, and an excellent first week on site. We're so excited for you to be started.
Yay! Happy first week, everyone!
Woo-hoo! Thank you. Bye-bye.